Okay, a really, really warm welcome to everybody to Britain's Forgotten Slave Owners as part of Black History Month at the University of Nottingham. Can everybody hear me okay? All good, okay. So as I'm sure you all know, and have been drawn here partly perhaps as a result of David Olusoga's BBC Two documentary that looked at the legacies of the British slave trade, particularly looking at in 1833 when the slave ownership was abolished. And the British government decided, rather than compensating those who had been enslaved, to compensate the 46,000 British slave owners for the loss of their own human property, paid out £17 billion in compensation money. And David's programme really looked at where that money went, why that money was spent, and the context of that. It was part of a wider project that was housed at the University College London called The Legacies of British Slave Ownership, and David worked very closely with them to develop this film. So what we're going to be doing today is David is kindly going to be talking for the next 40 minutes, half an hour, 40 minutes or so, and then we have Kate Donington, who is a fundamental part of the Legacies of British Slave Ownership project, is going to talk about that project, the development of that project and the research that went into it. And then Suzanne Seymour, who is at the University of Nottingham as well, is going to talk about the legacy of slave ownership in Nottingham itself. Is that right? Sort of. Just about. Okay. I'm going to introduce them each individually so you don't forget who they are before they come back. It's the evening after all. So let me start by introducing David Olusoga. He is a British-Nigerian historian, broadcaster and filmmaker. He was born in Lagos and studied history and journalism before he joined the BBC. He's been an award-winning documentary filmmaker and the co-author of The Kaiser's Holocaust, Germany's Forgotten Genocide, and the Colonial Roots of Nazism, as well as the author of The World's War and a contributor to the Oxford Companion of Black British History. His books and his documentaries have explored themes of empire, military history, race, slavery, and contemporary culture, or linking those histories to contemporary culture in the UK and in the USA. And he's currently writing a book on world slavery that presumably this project is a small part of. So before, without going on any further, I'll hand over to David to read his work.
Thank you very much. I'm someone who can write books and make TV programs. I can't get my printer to work, so I've got to talk from my screen, if you don't mind. It's genuinely great to be here in Nottingham. It's a city I've been coming to for a long time. It's a city I have friends and I have family in. It's a city I'm fond of. It's the city of George Scipio Africanus, the black 18th century entrepreneur, the city of black miners in the coalfields around this city, and the city of the other 1956 race riot, which is usually forgotten because of a more famous one in London. As long as most of the time I've been coming to Nottingham, I've also been working in the media, and in most of that time I've been making programs, as the kind introduction said, about slavery and colonialism, about the black presence in Britain, and about the global story of Britain's long relationship with Africa and people of African descent. And over the years of making programs on television and radio, writing for newspapers and writing books when I can, I've noticed that very often the titles for those media products, as when I'm encouraged to call them, have included words like forgotten or lost or hidden in the titles. And the program Britain's Forgotten Slave Owners went through various titles. We couldn't work out whether the slave owners should be secret, or whether they should be lost or hidden, before we decided that they were definitely forgotten. That seemed a safe enough bet. Now, this is partly because in TV, our bosses like the idea of hidden and lost and forgotten, because it speaks to the idea of exclusivity of news stories, and we have a cult of neophilia in television. But when it comes to the histories of black people, the histories of empire, forgotten is very often the right word. Sometimes an even better word is hidden, because so much of these histories have been deliberately hidden. One of the strangest things I think about Britain, and I know that people who come here and study history often say, is that while we still talk about being a country that had the greatest empire, the largest empire the world has ever seen, though that's a debatable claim, try telling that to a Spanish person and they'll give you another view of history. But at the same time, we struggle to remember and appreciate the extent to which that empire, the peoples within it, the peoples this country came to dominate, their cultures, the products that their labour produced, all combined to shape and change and influence our own culture, what makes us who we are, and what makes us who we are in terms of who came to this country, who are the modern Britons. I think one of the best places to see this, and many historians have used this example, about how unthinkingly global Britain is to take a look at our national drink, tea. Tea, of course, comes from China, and the British liked it so much that we began to grow it on an enormous scale, but not in China, but in India and Sri Lanka. At one point in the 19th century, there were over 1 million Indians working in the tea plantations of Ceylon and central India. We sweeten that drink in a way that many other cultures don't, with cane sugar, which is a plant that comes from New Guinea, but the British didn't discover it in New Guinea, the British discovered it in Brazil, and they cultivated it in the islands of the Caribbean using enslaved labour, the labour of millions of enslaved Africans. We drink this drink from porcelain that we still call Chinese porcelain. People have argued that the only thing in a British cuppa that's actually British is the milk, though actually the cows are Dutch, so I don't know whether that's even true. That history is global enough, and it's forgotten enough, but it skips another element if we want to stretch the tea story. Well, tea comes from China. To afford it before we started growing it in India, we had to exchange it for products of our manufacture that the Chinese wanted, but there was nothing that the Chinese emperors particularly wanted that Britain produced. So we came to exchange it for another Asiatic crop, opium. Again, that was produced in India. Opium was produced in India on an industrial scale, on a scale that the drug cartel bosses of Mexico could only dream of. And it was forced into China at gunpoint. When the Chinese resisted, we went to war on several occasions. They are the Opium Wars, plural. And in 1860, we destroyed one of the greatest features of Chinese civilization, the Summer Palace, all to force upon them a crop they didn't want so we could use it to barter for tea. We've forgotten that history, or that history's been hidden. Believe me, the Chinese haven't forgotten it. And in the coming decades of the 20th century, I fear they're going to remind us of it. But the Opium Wars, like the labour of the slaves that produced the sugar to go with the tea, have been deliberately hidden from British history. Yet these are parts of our history, though we have at this moment a strange effect that when this history is brought up, many people find their reaction is to get angry, to get frustrated, to feel as if fingers are pointed at them. People will say, we've already apologised for all of this history. That's hardly true. They'll say we're sick of being made to feel guilty and bad about the past. I'm afraid I'd say we've barely begun to confront our colonial past. And no one's asking anyone to feel personal guilt for things that happened 100, 200 years ago, the crimes of the forefathers. Some people will say that the things that Britain did are no worse than those done by other colonial powers. And there is some truth to that, but you might ask, so what? What does that mean? What does that mean to the victims or the descendants of the victims of British colonial power? And why should we not, even if other countries have bad histories, confront the worst parts of our past? Other than the Chinese, the victims of British-produced opium, the people in China who suffered, the price of the tea becoming sweet to become our national drink. The other victims, of course, were the African slaves who produced the sugar, who were sold, traded and forced to work in brutal, barbaric conditions within Britain's vast slave-owning and slave-trading empire. In the end, we called our series Britain's Forgotten Slave Owners. Not hidden, not secret. But then slave ownership is only one of the many aspects of Britain's slave trading and slave owning past which has been forgotten. This is a history that has been buried. Thousands of British families grew rich on the production of slave-produced sugar. Thousands of others grew rich on the slave trade. And in the time since the 1830s, they brushed those histories under the carpet. Dynastic stories were purified. Dark chapters were expunged. And across the country, we have a heritage industry, which is a key part of the history heritage complex in this country that is complicit in that. I live in Bristol. Bristol is covered in blue plaques, heritage plaques and city walks that will talk about West India planters. They mean slave owners. They'll talk about West India merchants. They mean slave traders. These are euphemisms. These are parts of language are used to pretend that certain things didn't happen or to disguise them, just to make them opaque. We can't expunge these things, but we can make them opaque, and we do. The Dictionary of National Biography, as the legacy of British slave ownership has demonstrated, has been especially culpable in this effort, this great forgetting, as I call it. One effect of this is if you ask most people in this country to describe slavery or to tell you the images that come into their mind when they think of slavery, they're more likely to tell you about the Deep South than the West Indies. They'll describe cotton fields and great white houses with columns at the end of long avenues of trees. They'll talk about images that come from Gone with the Wind and 12 Years a Slave and Roots. What they won't describe is the far more distant image to most people in this country, which is proto-industrial sugar slavery of the Caribbean, of Jamaica, Guyana, or Barbados, or other places. And this fixation with American slavery is part of this great forgetting. And because so little is known about British slavery, that fuels this feeling of justification in being persecuted when it's brought up. Because it comes as a shock, because it has been so well concealed, the anger and the emotions that come out when it is brought up are stronger. It seems to many people to be coming out of nowhere. This history, this unwelcome story from the past, suddenly being rammed down everyone's throat. The therapists who developed the 12-step program for the treatment of substance abuse would easily recognize this stage. This is the denial stage. And it's the stage that they will tell you patients need to escape from in order to begin meaningful treatment. I think we're in that process of beginning to escape from denial in this country about slavery and other aspects of our past. And I think some of the arguments that are being made by historians of colonialism, William Dalrymple, who I was talking about earlier, being one of them, is that it's probably not going to be the people of Africa and the Caribbean who forced Britain to confront the darker elements of our colonial past. It's going to be the Indians and the Chinese, two economic superpowers of the coming century, who haven't forgotten the burning of the Summer Palace, the Amritsar massacre. I think Britain is on a journey in the 21st century where it's going to need to confront uncomfortable facts. The uncomfortable facts of slavery are numerous. Britain was the biggest slave trading nation in Europe, and Britain was a major slave owning nation. Slavery was one of the sources of capital that funded Britain's industrial expansion, and its financial DNA is part of what made the City of London the financial centre that it is today. Some of the money raised to allow James Watt to develop a steam engine came from investments in slavery and sugar in the Caribbean. The literal and metaphorical icon of the Industrial Revolution has links to slavery. If you read the accounts of economists of the 18th century, they'll reiterate these points. They'll talk about the centrality of slave trade, the essential element of Britain's economy being the availability of African labour in the Caribbean. And they'll talk about it and be open about it, not because they have some sort of agenda, not because they're politically correct, but because they're economists at that time who were being frank about what matters to the British economy. The opposite, the converse truths are just the same. Britain did not abolish the trade in slaves first, that was the Danes, and we did not abolish the slave trade purely out of the goodness of our heart. We did it in part in response to revolutions among the slaves in Haiti. Likewise, slavery itself was abolished in part due to the bloody and extremely costly rebellion in Jamaica. Now, I'm a huge admirer of the abolitionists, Thomas Clarkson in particular. But they were just one of the forces that brought slavery to an end. They're not the whole story. And the abolitionists, and William Wilberforce in particular, have become part of this great forgetting. Their moral crusade, first against the slave trade and then against slavery, has become, to some extent, a fig leaf behind which the longer, darker, deeper story of Britain's involvement in slavery has been concealed. It's still the case in 2015 that William Wilberforce is the only household name in the whole story of slavery. There's no slave owner, there's no slave trader, and there's certainly no enslaved person who has anything like that name recognition. So it's not a surprise that in 2007, during the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade, the only feature film that Britain made was Amazing Grace, a biopic of William Wilberforce. Part of the process of remembering this deeper, bigger and darker history, the process of historical recovery that's needed for this nation to escape the denial phase, is being undertaken at the University College London. The Legacies of British Slave Ownership project has taken a set of records that historians of slavery always knew were there, and it's analysed them in a way that I, for one, certainly didn't think was possible or I'd ever see. I can't do maths, I'm crap with numbers, so it was never going to be me. It was going to take someone like Nick Draper and Catherine Hall, who run the project, to do that. It's an ongoing project, and the results of stage 2 were the raw material for the television series that I had the honour of presenting earlier this year. Now, we have Katie Donington from the Legacy of British Slave Ownership project here speaking tonight, so I'm not going to go into the details of the project. She knows them better. She sees it from the inside, so it would be bizarre for me to discuss that. But what I will say is that the project is helping us confront one of the most glaring omissions in the way we think about slavery, the way we teach slavery in this country. Children, well, the children who are taught about slavery in this country, and hopefully more of them will be taught with the controversial new curriculum, are taught about the Abolition Act. They're taught about the fact that in the summer of 1833, the Act was passed through Parliament, freeing instantly 800,000 Africans. Well, I say instantly. Of course, they weren't freed instantly. A big aspect of that Act was a part which isn't really talked about very much whenever we discuss slavery and abolition, which is the apprenticeship system, which is that the slaves continue to work after their supposed manumission. But the real glaring omission is compensation. The response to the television series Britain's Forgotten Slave Owners, to me, is proof that very few people were aware of the work that LBS did, and very few people were aware of the compensation clause within the Abolition of Slavery Act. When we were making the TV series, myself, my colleagues, the producers, the researchers, everybody who was involved in it, we kept reporting the same story, that we'd speak to our friends and our family, and we'd say, we're making this series, and it's about compensation and slavery. And halfway through the conversation, our friends or relatives would realise they got the wrong end of the stick, and it was the slave owners who were getting the compensation. And we'd have to start the conversation again because they got the wrong idea. And I think that's because in the 21st century mentality, compensation and victimhood naturally go together.
The idea that the perpetrators, the owners of slaves, received the compensation short-circuits the 21st century mindset. It didn't have that impact in the 19th century. And people are shocked by the facts. Looking at the reaction of the series, we know we have all sorts of monitoring in television. We know what people were shocked about. We have thousands of comments that come through online in social media. And people were shocked by the numbers. They were shocked that £20 million, 40% of total government expenditure for the year 1834, was set aside for the compensating of the 46,000 slave owners. They're shocked that that equates to, in one way of calculating it, between 16 and 17 billion pounds in today's money. And they were also shocked, to my surprise, by the apprenticeship clause. Now, all of these things were shocking because all of these things were generally unknown. And when we looked at the logs that come in after a television program, that's what we discovered. We were surprised by people's surprise. George Orwell once described Britain as a wealthy family, or being like a wealthy family, that has a pretense of guilty silence about the sources of its wealth. Orwell, whose real name, as I'm sure you all know, was Eric Blair, had been witness to that conspiracy of silence, close up and personal. His father was Richard W. Blair, and he was a civil servant who oversaw plantations in India. They were situated near the Nepalese border, and those plantations produced a tiny amount of the opium that was dumped on China in exchange for tea. The civil service department that the elder Orwell worked for was called, without any sense of embarrassment or desire to conceal, it was openly called the Opium Department. But the origins of the Blair family fortune, a fortune that had been largely squandered by the time Eric was born, stemmed from their investments far from India in another highly addictive product. The records that the Legacies of British Slave Ownership Project have analysed show that in 1833, Charles Blair, George Orwell's ancestor, was the owner of 218 men and women and children. And for those human beings, he was paid £4,442 in compensation, the modern equivalent of around £3 million. I don't generally believe in heroes. I don't see myself as somebody who has heroes. But if I was forced to choose one, it would be Orwell. He spent much of his life asking questions about this country, asking his fellow countrymen to look at this country, its class system, its economics, and its empire, and to confront realities and secrets about those phenomena. The Orwell family epic, over generations, a story of sugar, slavery, opium, and empire, is a story of secrets and lies, and yet it produced one of the most starkly honest writers that this country or any country has ever known. Orwell is a man who offered stark warnings about the future, but I think his biography is one of hope, that it is possible for individuals, and I hope also for countries, to confront the worst aspects of their past. I see Orwell as a man whose destiny to be a parachik with an empire was set for him. He was, after all, a colonial policeman in Burma. And he rejected all of that and became someone who analysed the excesses and the violence and the corruption at the heart of empire in a way few people have. And I think he's, in that way, a model for the journey that I hope that we're beginning to go on in this country. It's been a long road. Black history, what we call black history in this country, really only began in the 60s and 70s. And that's what I'd like to talk about for the last sort of 5 minutes that I have with you today. Because that's all, after all, why we're all here tonight, because it's Black History Month. Because 29 years ago, an idea that was invented in the United States was borrowed by black activists in London, and a month was set aside to mark black history. That me and other speakers are here is part of the evidence that Black History Month works. Black History Month gives journalists and broadcasters a topical hook on which they can hang stories that might otherwise not be told. And it's difficult to explain the extent to which topicality and what we call a hook in journalism really, really matters. Whenever you sit down and try to sell an idea in the media, to a news editor or to a television commissioner, they'll say, why do it now? What's the reason for doing it now? Why can't we put it off for 10 years? Black History Month answers those questions. It makes things happen. It unearths stories and brings them to light in ways that wouldn't happen otherwise. But I think Black History Month does have some serious problems. It works, as I say, when it makes things happen that otherwise wouldn't happen. I think it fails when it becomes a ghetto in which we dump all black stories, history or contemporary culture. There are those within the organisations who run Black History who are genuinely angry when a programme or an article goes out outside of October. We talk about we want Black History 12 months a year. Sometimes we don't. But I think the biggest problem is the over-reliance on biography. And that Black History has become, I think, too much a history of the black presence in Britain. I'm not saying that's not important, but it's becoming the majority, the vast majority of what we talk about. The first problem is that biography has at times come to displace and obscure history rather than deepen it and explain it. The problem with biography, especially heroic biography, is that it forces us into a ceaselessly celebratory tone. Black historical figures are transmuted from being historical figures, real people, complicated people, into black heroes, often two-dimensional. And we spend too much time making them into saints, and that can get us into silly arguments with people who want to challenge our beatification of these black historical figures. And I think this is a trap. But the bigger issue is that the story of the slave owners, like the story of the slave owners and their opponents here in Britain, the men who built the empire in Africa, are also part of black history. I think the series that we made with Katie and our colleagues at Legacy British Slave Ownership is black history. It was about the slave owners. It wasn't about the slaves. And we did get criticism early on. Why would you want to make a program that's not about the enslaved? And I think that's mainly what we've done in the media. We've thought naturally, understandably, I think in a very human way, that if you're going to talk about slavery, we should talk about the victims. And I totally understand the reasons behind that thinking, and I think we've done that, and we should keep doing it. But very often, to understand the power of slavery, to understand the immensity of how it changed this country, we need to talk about the perpetrators, not the victims. Because black history has to be more than just the history of the black experience. It is in some ways the history of a long, difficult, tragic relationship between Britain and the peoples of Africa. A story of trade and fascination, of slavery and exploitation, but also of exoticism and eroticism, of misunderstanding and confusion, of immigration, of emigration, a tragedy that takes place on 3 continents, but also takes place within families. It's a joint history, and it's all the more joint given the demographics of Britain. Britain is racially mixing at a rate that is absolutely phenomenal and unprecedented. Black history can't be the ethnic property of any one group. It's not for us and about us, whoever us is. If it's seen as ethnic property, then we risk being trapped in this history ghetto. We risk devoting all our energies to the search for and the defense of black heroes. And I think that is a road to self-marginalization. One of the reasons that I'm proud of the series that, as I said, I had the honour of presenting, is not just because it's one of the rare moments in British television when cutting-edge historical research was brought from the Academy onto the screen, but because I think it's helping to widen, just a little bit, our idea of what black history is. And I think that wider, more inclusive, deeper, and I think more sophisticated version of black history is where I hope we can go next. And I hope to be back with you in a few Black History Months' time, talking about more projects that are in that tradition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for that fascinating and very inspiring talk. I'm going to hand over now to Katie Donington, who worked both as a doctoral student and then as a postdoctoral researcher with the Legacies of British Slave Ownership project at the University College London. And so she knows the the workings of the research that went into the BBC documentary Britain's Forgotten Slave Owners, and she's going to talk about that tonight. Katie's currently, having finished up with the Legacies of British Slave Trade project, is now co-director of the Centre for Race and Research in Race and Rights here in Nottingham, and a research associate with the Anti-Slavery Usable Past project. Her research in general focuses on networks of slavery, family and commerce in Britain and Jamaica during the abolition period, so during the 19th century, early and later 19th century. And she is the co-author of Legacies of British Slave Ownership, Colonial Slavery and the Formation of Victorian Britain, which is relatively hot off the press. It was published last year in 2014 by Cambridge. So I'm going to hand over to her.
Okay, well, I want to say thank you as well. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight. It's my first Black History Month with the University of Nottingham, so I hope to see you all at more occasions in the future. Now, I've gone one step further. I not only didn't work my printer, but I've also not brought my notes on my laptop. So this is from memory. So I spent 6 years working with the Legacies of British Slave Ownership project. As Annie said, first as a PhD student, in which my research focused on a single slave-owning family, the Hibbets, who were featured in the documentary series that David made. And then secondly, I was the only researcher working on slave ownership in Jamaica for the second phase of the project. So what I'm going to do tonight, briefly, because I know we haven't got a huge amount of time, is discuss the first phase of the project, then discuss the second phase of the project, and if there's time, I'll tell you a little bit about the case study of the Hibbett family, but we may or may not get round to that. So the Legacies of British Slave Ownership project began in 2009, and it began kind of off the back of the lead project investigator, Dr. Nick Draper's PhD research. So he was looking at the compensation records, and he realised that we could bring together historiographical debate, archival records, and the wonder of new technologies. So he took the compensation records, which are housed in Kew, and he digitised them essentially. So I was going to start with my first slide. So this is an image from the 1830s, and it does show a really horribly kind of caricatured group of enslaved people. But what it also shows here is the figure of John Ball, which is supposed to represent Britain, having £20 million stolen out of his back pocket. And you can see the open hand of the planter waiting there to have the money put in. And I think this image kind of sums up some of the debates that were happening at the time. So when we think about the ending of British Caribbean slavery, as David mentioned, I think we think about William Wilberforce, and we think about the abolitionists, and we think about the humanitarian reasons for the abolition of slavery. What we don't necessarily think about or talk about is the economic process that went along with the abolition of slavery. And that economic process was the payment of £20 million worth of compensation to the slave owners. Now, the issue of compensation wasn't a particularly new one. Pretty much from the moment that the abolition movement started in the 1780s, talking about the abolition of the slave trade, the planters, the slave traders, the merchants, they were all interested in compensation. So you can read in the 1790s that people are advocating compensation, because you've got to remember that during this period of time, property was something that was sacrosanct, and if property was going to be taken away by the government, then property was going to have to be compensated for. And in this instance, we're talking about property in people, which is an absolutely kind of abhorrent way of framing it to our eyes. But then at that particular moment in time, people were using as an equivalent, what happens when the government wants to, build a railway or build a dock, and they have to purchase your land. So they're talking about compulsory purchase ordering as the background for the compensation of property if the government took it away. And it was pretty much something that there wasn't a huge reluctance to go along with from the abolitionists. There were some lone voices who were against the compensation process, but the majority of people did agree that compensation should be paid. What happened then is that this kind of created a sort of a surge of people who then were willing to come forward, put their hands up and say, you know, I think I have property and people. And this creates a huge bureaucratic record then of every single person who thought that they might have a claim in these monies, and who thought they might own property and people. And I say who thought they might own because a lot of these claims were contested. Not all of them were successful, but it creates this record of who the slave owners were at the ending of Caribbean slavery. And as I said, the records are all held at Kew, and the records tell you the name of the person who thinks that they own property and people, tells you where they live, it tells you their gender, it tells you how many enslaved people they thought they owned, where those enslaved people were located. So it really enables you to build up a picture of who these people were and how they relate kind of in terms of geography to both Britain but also the Caribbean as well. And so these records have been sitting there for a long time. Trinidadian historian Eric Williams references them in his book Capitalism and Slavery, but of course he didn't have the technology to do the kinds of things that we could do with them today, like build a database and have all this information online. So in 2009, the ESRC funded the project to build this database, and this took, it was I think approximately 46,000 claimants that came forward, and of those claimants that came forward, about 10 million of the compensation money stayed in Britain, and about 10 million of it went out into the Caribbean. And what we did was we focused on the recipients of the £10 million that stayed in Britain, because what we were thinking about were some of those ideas that Eric Williams raises about what's the relationship between capitalism and slavery, what's the relationship between industrialisation and slavery, are we actually seeing the impact of slave-based wealth on Britain? And I think that's an important question to raise, because I think slavery can tend to cause a polarisation in debate between people who say everything in Britain is built on the back of enslaved people, and at the opposite end of the spectrum, people who say slavery is nothing to do with the creation of Great Britain. And I think these set of records offer a window into thinking about an empirical basis for that debate. Now, it's not the be-all and the end-all, and there's a lot more work to be done, but it does give you, at least for that moment in time, a kind of a sort of idea, a picture of who was involved. As I think has been drawn out, it's who was involved in slave ownership, slave trading, sugar merchants, all these other affiliate industries are not captured by the database. So it is very specifically about slave ownership. And I'll just go back to that slide before. That's where the database is available. It's freely available. It's openly accessible. And what that database contains is not just the raw details of the claim forms, which look like this. These are the kinds of things that were transcribed. This is a claim form from Trelawney in Jamaica. But for 3,000 of the slave owners in the database, the team wrote biographies. And those biographies were an attempt to kind of look at the ways in which these people had impacted on various different spheres of British life. So we identified different legacy strands that we were interested in. And these involved, the commercial world. So what kinds of commercial activities did these people engage in? What did they invest in? Did they invest in, docks, railways? Did they invest in insurance? Did they invest in banking? To try and build up a picture of what their impact was within the world of business and commerce. Then we looked at cultural legacies. So did people invest in book collections, art collections, botanical collections? And if they did, where are those objects now? Can we find those objects in things like our national galleries, our national museums? We looked at political legacies. So were the slave owners MPs? Were they involved in local government? And if they were, what sorts of issues did they lobby on? What were they interested in? How were they shaping British politics? We looked at physical legacies. So what did they build? What's the physical evidence that we can find for these people? And I mean, one of the strands that we looked at around that was country houses, and it was quite kind of timely because at the same time English Heritage were also looking at the relationship between slavery and the country house. So that was kind of one of the other strands we looked at. We looked at whether or not they went out into different parts of empire, and if they did go out into different parts of empire, did they bring some of the ideas they might have developed through slave ownership with them? So we looked at their activities in places like Australia or India, South Africa, Canada. And then finally, we also looked at what we described as historical memories. But this was the ways in which slave owners chose to write about and represent the West Indies, both during the period of slavery but also afterwards. And how did that writing shape Victorian ideas about race and racial thinking? Did it have an impact? Did it have a legacy in the form of racism? So there are kind of some of the issues that we were looking at with phase one, and as I said, we used this compensation methods to do that. But it does leave a big gap, a big kind of, okay, that's fine for a snapshot, but what about the earlier period, arguably a more profitable period for some of the colonies? So whereas British Guiana was extremely profitable in the 1830s when slavery was abolished, in the earlier period, in the 18th century, Jamaica was extremely profitable. And so what's missing from the database, if you only look at the compensation records, are those families that were involved in the earlier period, and also those families that were involved transgenerationally. So those people who had been in Jamaica or who had been in Barbados for generations, who often built enormous fortunes, but who exited the slavery business kind of at what they deemed to be the right time because they could see the writing on the wall. So the second phase of the project, which is funded by the ESRC and the AHRC, looks at an earlier period. It looks at who the slave owners were during the period 1833 going back to 1763. And for this project, the set of records is far more diffuse. There wasn't, kind of handy set of documents at the National Archives that you could just go and look at. So it's involved us as a team actually going to the Caribbean to do research. So I was in Jamaica for just under 6 months looking at the records there. And we used, for every island, you use a different set of records because every island is individual, has its own history, has its own set of records. But for Jamaica, I was using things like, you can use things like tax returns. You can also use it's a set of documents called the crop accounts, which was designed to prevent fraud on the estate. So if someone wasn't living in the island, if they were an absentee, if they were living in Britain and withdrawing their wealth from Jamaica, by law, their overseer or their manager had to go and fill in a form and tell the authorities how much that plantation was producing. So it gives us a record of absenteeism in Jamaica. So this is the second phase of the project. I don't think I'm going to have time to talk to you about a case study, but just to say that some of the activities that we've also done along with it, David mentioned the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. Well, there is quite a sort of good update from that, in that the ODMB has commissioned a large number of biographies to be written of these slave owners. They've also commissioned our project administrator, who's also a researcher, to amend the entries on the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography so that they reflect the reality of the language, which is slave trader, slave owner, not West Indian proprietor. So that's a kind of a positive story coming out, but there is obviously still a huge amount of work to do. And once we have this second phase of the database up online, it will, I think, generate even more work, because one of the things that has been great about this project, I think, is the public history aspect of it. So working with David on the BBC documentaries, but also the fact that this is an open access database, people can contribute towards it themselves. So there's a button online where you can click and you can send in information that you might have about your family, that you might know about particular plantations. And so it's been a process of us putting some stuff out, but then also the public, massively helping us in terms of giving us information about, their own family histories. And I think the next phase will see that repeated. So I guess final thing to end with is why? What's the point of doing this? Well, I think that as a team, we kind of agreed that this kind of history writing is a necessary corrective to those stories of abolitionism that David has mentioned. How can you possibly talk about abolitionism if you're not going to talk about the history of slavery and slave ownership to begin with? And this project is about putting that history back into the narrative of British history more generally, so that people can understand the huge contribution that enslaved people made, not willingly, they were forced to do it, but made to the development of modern Britain as we know it now. So I'll leave it now because I think I've spoken over.
So our final speaker is probably quite a familiar face to many of you. Suzanne Seymour is an Associate Professor of Geography and Deputy Director of the Institute for the Study of Slavery at the University of Nottingham. And she is a cultural and historical geographer looking at the relationship between estates and plantations in England and the Caribbean and the symbolic and material aspects of landed estates. She's published broadly in the Journal of Historical Geography, Slavery in the British Country House, and numerous others that I cut down to keep this introduction short. But probably where many of you have come across her is in her work on the Global Cotton Connections project, which is an Arts and Humanities Research Council, as was the LBS project, funded collaboration with local community groups, so worked very closely, or is still working very closely, right? Is the project still ongoing? Okay, sort of still working, with African Caribbean diaspora and Hindu cultural heritage in both Nottingham and in Sheffield, and has looked carefully at the slave legacies in heritage venues in this region. She's also been looking to bring together the links between Global Cotton Connections and the Institute for the Study of Slavery, and I'm going to hand over to her to talk a little bit about that.
Right, well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak this evening. I'd like to show you 3 key ways in which the research that I've been involved with over recent years has drawn on and complemented this really important work that's been done on the legacies of British slave ownership. Firstly, I want to highlight how British connections with slavery went beyond this direct ownership of enslaved Africans, highlighted by the compensation records. So we can see further connections, as David has already highlighted, and Kate too. Further connections were through things like slave trading, through investment in slave-based enterprises, and through trading in slave-produced goods, and through things like lobbying over abolition, both pro or anti-abolition, and through the presence of free or formerly enslaved Africans. And that really shows a much deeper economic and social engagement with slavery than the compensation records alone suggest. And so there's almost like the compensation records being like a tip of an iceberg, I think you might say. To illustrate this, as part of an AHRC-funded Diverse Rural Legacies project, we mapped slavery connections in 3 eastern counties, Angus in Scotland, Norfolk and Nottinghamshire in England, according to a selection of categories that go beyond whether someone actually owned enslaved Africans or not. And these categories include things like whether people were involved in the slave trade or whether they were involved in trading in slave-based goods. And you can go onto the website, which is shown here, to look at this interactive map. So you can click on to one of these blobs, I think this is Newstead Abbey, and find more information about the different types of connection. We were also interested in colonial connections too. And if you want to add material to this database, you can email me and it's open to further entries. So that's just one way of showing these connections, and the compensation records are mapped on there, thanks to the UCL team. Also, as part of the AHRC-funded Global Cotton Connections project, we highlighted how the cotton industry in the Derwent Valley, seen as the birthplace of the British Industrial Revolution by many, had important trade links with slavery through the purchase of raw cotton. And here there are a couple of maps that you probably can't see all the detail of, but they show the importance of locations where enslaved Africans were used to produce cotton. So, for example, this map shows Brazil as a very important source, but also the West Indies. What we did was map a very important cotton-producing family, the Strutt family, their cotton supplies in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And some of it's from a book published in the 1950s, and some is from our own research for a more limited period. It really does make that connection very strongly about how important slavery was to the British cotton industry. Secondly, I want to emphasise how, while we might know more about Britain's involvement in slavery as academics, wider interested publics, and now TV viewers, little of this information is presented in the heritage venues, which benefited directly from money generated through the slave trade and its associated businesses. This book's already been mentioned. For example, my colleague from history, Dr. Sherilyn Haggerty, and I, back in 2009, undertook research for English Heritage into the slavery connections of two of its country houses. And this research was on Brodsworth Hall in South Yorkshire and Bolsover Castle in Derbyshire. This research was integrated into a chapter in this book, Slavery and the British Country House. And despite the efforts of its editors, there's been little impact of this research or the other research reported there in the country house venues themselves. Part of our research, as I've said, was on Bolsover Castle, which was owned by the Portland family. They also owned Welbeck Abbey, still do actually, and they also have connections with the university. A later member, the 7th Duke, was Chancellor of the university, and the Portland building, shown here, was named after him. Now, the family, whilst not in receipt of compensation themselves, had a number of other complicated links to slavery. The first Duke was a plantation owner in Jamaica in the 1720s. He also lost a fortune as an investor in the South Sea Company when it collapsed. And this is a company which specialised in slave trading to the Americas. The third Duke was an important national politician who quietly resisted abolition and was a huge defender of this principle of property. He also advised on the management of slave rebellions in the Caribbean and movements of freed Africans and free Maroons to Canada and Sierra Leone during his time in the Colonial Office. The fourth Duke of Portland supported slavery and had Anglo-Dutch cousins who were compensated as plantation owners. But his brother, Lord William Bentinck, supported abolition, although he also applied for compensation as a trustee. So it's quite a complicated family, but one who has these intimate connections with slavery, which are not often talked about in the context of the university. Thirdly, to help challenge and address these silences in heritage venues, I've been working alongside community and heritage groups to try to make changes happen. I see it as particularly important to work with and learn from people from the African diaspora, both because the perspectives of those with enslaved ancestors are often ignored, especially as both the heritage industry and academia lack employee diversity, and I'm sort of an embodiment of that, I guess. And in order to avoid reproducing negative stereotypes in representations of slavery. A key development has been the launch of the Nottingham Slave Trade Legacies Initiative in 2014, facilitated by Bright Ideas Nottingham and in particular Lisa Robinson. Associated with this have been two startup projects. First, The Colour of Money, run by Bright Ideas and funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund. And second, the Global Cotton Connections project, funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and involving this university and Sheffield and Leicester as well, together with collaboration from the Derwent Valley Mills World Heritage Site and the Arkwright Society. Both projects have worked with local Nottingham people, mainly from the African diaspora and with enslaved African ancestors, who have become the Nottingham Slave Trade Legacies Group, and I know there are some of you in the audience. The Slave Trade Legacies Group has achieved many things. It has engaged with old and new historical research, which in relation to cotton counters a curtailed narrative of raw cotton origins found in some mill heritage sites that claim that cotton came on pack horse from Liverpool. It has undertaken visits to a range of heritage venues, including museums, country houses, port cities and cotton mills, and reflected on these experiences. It has commented on proposals for heritage materials to be used in the new World Heritage Site Gateway Visitor Centre being developed at Cromford and due to go public later this year. Also, it has produced two powerful films highlighting the gaps in histories presented in heritage venues. And the film Global Cotton Connections, Untangling the Threads of Slavery was recently shown at Cromford Mills in the World Heritage Site as part of the Connected Communities Festival fortnight. We showed it 3 times. It was quite busy. I want to end with an advert. Both this film, the Cotton film, and the Colour of Money film will be shown and discussed here in this venue as part of Black History Month next Monday. Okay, thank you very much.